Let's look at the Gospels. First, take a look at the exercise on slide 1. Slide 1. What is the relationship between the first 5 books of the New Testament? Please pause the video here so that you can answer the question. What is the relationship between the first 5 books of the New Testament? Well, the first 5 books of the New Testament are Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. The first 4 are Gospels. The book of Acts is the story of the early church, from Jesus' ascension until the Apostle Paul's house arrest in Rome, awaiting trial before Caesar. All 5 books are historical narrative. That's their literary type, their historical narrative. Both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written by Luke. The Gospel dealing with Jesus' life from his birth until his ascension, and then Luke's second book picking up roughly at the same point that the Gospel ends and continuing the story from there of the early church. Acts then is a sort of sequel to the Gospel of Luke. Introducing the Gospels. The word gospel comes from an old English word, Godspell, meaning good news. It's actually a direct translation of the Greek word euangelion, good news. In the first century world, this word, euangelion, good news, was often used to describe an announcement of important news. The early church used this term gospel to describe the type of literature that we find in these first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These accounts are seen as announcements of important news about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. So, for example, Mark's opening words are this: the beginning of the euangelion, the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. The Gospels then provide us with biographical accounts of Jesus' life and his teaching, and particularly focus on his death and his resurrection. The 4 Gospels together make up approximately 46% of the entire New Testament, just less than half of the New Testament. The first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are sometimes referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. That comes from a Greek word synopsis, which means to see together. One of the things a careful reader of the Gospels will notice is that although each Gospel writer makes their own unique contribution, the first 3 Gospels have many similarities. Not only do they cover the same material, they often do so in the same order. In fact, they use sometimes exactly the same words. There can be little doubt then that there is some sort of literary relationship between these first 3 Gospels. In other words, there seems to have been some copying going on. John's Gospel seems to have been written independently, although probably I think with an awareness of the synoptic tradition of those first 3 Gospels. Each of the Gospel writers presents Jesus with their own theological emphasis. The Gospels are different. but they're complementary, so that together they provide us with a rich portrait of who Jesus is. One of the most common ways of describing the literary relationship between those first three Gospels is known as the two-source hypothesis. Please can you have a look at slide 2. The relationship of the Gospels, the two-source hypothesis. Here, the suggestion is that Mark was written first and that Matthew and Luke have used Mark and another source called Q in writing their Gospels. The suggestion that Mark has written first is sometimes known as the priority of Mark.